Hello students, I am Dr. M. Bhushanam, Assistant Professor in Zoology, Maharani Science College for Women, Bengaluru. Hope all is well. Take care of your good health during this pandemic time. Today, we shall learn another topic in Zoology, Paper 7, that is 3.2e, Isolation and Isolating Mechanisms that acts as an evolutionary force in speciation. Specifically, the topic of geographical isolation. The objective of the study is to understand various isolating mechanisms involved in the process of speciation. The contents include isolation and isolating mechanisms that acts as the evolutionary forces in speciation. Under isolation, the concept of geographical isolation we shall understand in this session. Coming on to the introduction part. Students, before I go in detail about the topic, this particular concept of isolation and isolating mechanisms is very important for major question, and even for short note question it is most repeated concept. Well, the introduction part we shall understand the meaning of the term isolation. The term isolation in crude sense means separation or segregation. In evolutionary term, the isolation means segregation of a given population into smaller units by certain of mechanisms, so that it prevents the interbreeding or mating among the individuals. In simple terms, isolation refers to dividing off a huge population into smaller groups by means of some barriers. The barriers for the reproduction process, so that the individuals of one group won't mate with or reproduce with another group. So it is simply division of a large group of population into smaller units, and these smaller units won't further mate. So this is the importance of isolation term. Here, there occurs genetic obstruction for the gene transfer or gene flow between the populations. Down in the picture of the slide, there are two pictures representing the isolation mechanism. In the left side is porkfish, which is one of the species, towards Pacific Ocean. The other one is in Canadian Ocean. Both the fishes externally shows certain of differences, or by appearance they show certain of differences. But the body features remain same. These two species are separated hereby the barrier of ocean. They won't reproduce or mate with each other. So the species towards one side and the species towards the other side of the ocean won't mate. So there is separation of population here reproductively. Similar process is seen among the second picture towards the right side, which represents salamander in California, where the ancestral population gets separated by the rivers, so two genetically different species are getting formed, which do not show the process of mating. So one ancestral or original population, if it's dividing into many small groups by means of barriers for the reproduction, is called isolation. And the mechanisms that are involved varies further, which we call it as isolating mechanisms. It was Theodor Dobzhansky in 1930s coined the term isolation and isolating mechanisms for such processes of separation of ancestral population into smaller groups by barriers. According to Dobzhansky, isolating mechanisms are mainly classified into two types. Number one, geographical isolation. Number two, reproductive isolation. Down in the slide is a picture of rabbits and squirrels. The first picture of rabbit shows geographical isolation. Second of squirrels show reproductive isolation. What's the difference exactly? In geographic isolation, certain of natural geographical barriers will divide or separate a huge population into smaller groups. Example, the barriers like river, deep sea, thick forest, mountains, deserts, or a very vast land, etc. So that each individuals of separated group undergoes certain of changes in their genes, or sometimes may show mutation, and becomes totally a new species. So the geographical barriers will divide, the physical barriers otherwise, will divide the original population into smaller groups, and they make the smaller groups totally different with the genetic variation, and they never come for the process of mating. So this kind of isolation we call it as geographical isolation. So that we find in the rabbits of two species. You can see totally the two different species towards the left side are different. They cannot reproduce because they are geographically isolated by means of the thick forests. Whereas in the second type, called reproductive isolation, the geographical barriers will make the separation of original population into smaller groups, no doubt. But these smaller groups will form totally a different kind of species due to the genetical changes in them. They remain, for the reason is that they remain separated for years and years together, so that both of the group becomes totally a new species or a new population, which do not mate or reproduce even if they come closer, even if they come together. So this kind of isolation we call it as reproductive isolation, because they are two different species, they cannot have the reproduction process at all. Genus will remain same. Remember students, genus will remain same, but the species will vary. Here is an example of Albert and Kaibab squirrels, which are seen towards the right side. You can see totally there are certain changes in the features of the organisms itself. You can see the kind of ears that they have, the tail that they have, the color of the body that they have, all varies. The fur type what they have, all it varies. So all this it brings in totally a new type of species for the genus. So this we call it as reproductive isolation. Let us now concentrate on the actual topic, that is geographical isolation. As we understood just now, geographical isolation refers to separation of a population into smaller groups by means of natural physical barriers. It includes the examples of river, deep sea, mountains, deserts, thick forests, long bridges, ice glacier mountains, or even a very vast or large land, etc. These barriers physically prevent the mating or interbreeding of separated individuals. Hence, the barriers are called physical barriers, and the type of geographical isolation can also be called as physical isolation. So what's the other name for geographical isolation? Physical isolation. Why do we call this physical isolation? Because geographical barriers or physical barriers are involved. So physical barriers are the barriers what we can see, like river, deep sea, mountain, deserts, thick forests, long bridges, glacier mountains, and even a very vast land. And hence we call it as physical isolation. Example. Here down in the slide we can see an ancestral fox population is getting divided by means of barriers, and a few will reach Arctic region and a few will reach a forest region down. The Arctic region population of foxes will adjust to the environment of glaciers, the ice-cold environment, and become a species which are called as Arctic foxes. So Arctic fox species are white in color, that you can see at the top of this picture. Down, there is one more species of the fox population which has reached the forest area, and they developed the gray color fur of the body. So the original population, some have moved to the Arctic region, some have moved to the forest region. This separation is due to the barrier or physical or natural geographical barriers. So one has become Arctic fox of white fur, the other fox which is of gray color. So two species of foxes obtained from the original population, which we call it as geographical isolation. A common process that we find in geographical isolation is, number one, the original population is getting divided into subgroups by the geographical barriers. The original ancestral population is getting divided into subgroups by means of geographical barriers. This is point number one. Number two, the separated groups now get exposed to newer environment. Got it? So first the group of original population is getting divided into two or few small groups by means of barriers. And this group of population which has entered into a different place now started exposed to a newer environment. And they acquire new characters by mutations to adjust to newer environment. So they tend to have certain genetic variations in them. Original population is divided into small groups by barriers. Number two, each of this group will expose to a newer environment. Number three, this newer organisms into the newer places tend to acquire newer genetic characters and become new species. So this is how geographical isolation brings in the process of speciation. Down in the picture, we can see how this group of lizard family is getting divided into two different species by means of physical barrier of river here. Point number 4. The new variations when the organisms possess, they tend to add new genes to the gene pool of that particular population. So new characters, when they imbibe, they have genetic variations. This new alleles will be added to the gene pool. And fifth point is a new species gets evolved. So when these alleles are inherited to the generations. So this type of speciation takes place in the smaller groups of organisms, which will take up a very long period of time. Such species which are newly formed due to the geographical barriers is called as allopatric speciation. It is formed due to the geographical barriers. So the kind of species that are formed of the original formed from the original population, we call by means of the geographical barriers, we call them as allopatric speciation. Okay, and the species are called allopatric species. Here is another example of owls. Northern spotted owl called as Strix accidentalis, then accidentalis carina. And the other species is Mexican spotted owl called as Strix occidentalis lucida. So carina lucida variety. Another is here the geographical barrier is the mountains. The mountains will divide the original population of the genus Strix accidentalis into two species of carina and lucida. So this is another example of geographical isolation, and you can see the feature differences between the two species. Another example for geographical isolation is a small stream of water acts as a barrier for insects and birds, and even for the small mammals like squirrels. The example of squirrels, when we look at Grand Canyon, Arizona, has the northern part of it a squirrel type called as kaibab squirrels that lives in the north part. They have black color belly. Another species of squirrel called Albert species with light colored belly that lives in the south part. So it is the same area of Grand Canyon. The north side we have those species of squirrels of Khyber and abort species towards the south side. They have the physical variations. Appearance wise they shows the difference in the color of the belly. One is of Khyber is of dark color belly and abort is of a light colored belly. Two different species. It is due to the forest which is seen in between and even the mountain ranges. A classical example for geographical isolation is Darwin's Galapagos finches. There are 14 to 15 species of finches which were seen in the Galapagos Islands. They all look different and utilize different food sources. As the food sources are different, the beaks what this species had showed variations in it. So down in the picture we can see their beak modification. So each of the island shows different kind of food availability so that the beak showed modification. They are all finch varieties only. But the kind of food source have modified, have made the finches to have modified beaks. You can see at a very closer setup, the picture towards the right side, how the beaks of these finches are all. So this is a classical example of Darwin related to geographical isolation. There is a human tribe in Amazon forest that has not made any contacts with the Brazil population till today. Down in the picture we can see these tribes. They tend to have a total separation from the Brazilian individuals, and they tend to have a new characters in them. So it is another example of geographical isolation. Generally, geographical isolation separates a group of population by means of barriers, physical barriers. Each subgroups will now develop totally into a newer characters by means of mutations or genetic changes in order to suit or fit to the newer environment as what we have learnt earlier. So, they form totally a new species in later days. These individuals of two species never reproduce or mate, hence we call the geographical isolation leading to the concept of reproductive isolation. So geographical isolation can lead into reproductive isolation in due course of time. It is due to the lack of connectedness as we see in the picture down here of rabbits. You can see towards the right side, totally the original population of ancestral characters are retained, whereas the right side rabbit population, when we look at it, totally changes with their characters. So this is how totally two different types of species are formed. So when a physical geographical barriers brings in totally two different kind of species which cannot mate later when they come together is called reproductive isolation. So remember students here, geographical isolation can lead into reproductive isolation. The reason to understand how the geographical isolation leads to reproductive isolation. Number one, new species will experience and expose to new environment like new temperature, new rainfall, then predators, competitors, etc. at a very vast area of barrier. Example is Arctic and grey fox species, what we have learned in the previous slide. The temperature is totally different of the two zones, a forest and Arctic zone. So, accordingly, the two new species have evolved, leading to the concept of geographical isolation leading to reproductive isolation. Number two, these species undergo mutations or any genetic changes by chance or randomly. The same example can be quoted here. Therefore, a new species gets evolved from them, and this is due to a concept referred as adaptation or adaptive radiation. Down in the picture, when we look at, we find towards the left side, the originality of the characters are mostly retained, so they all appear whitish of rabbits, which are geographically isolated. So here the geographical barrier is a river. Towards the right side, when we look at, the color of the rabbit is getting changed to darker, gray or black. Why it is? It is due to the change in the adaptation. The organisms imbibe new characters in them when they get exposed to a newer environment, and there it has to survive, so they adapt themselves to a newer environment, which we call it as adaptive radiation. So this adaptive radiation totally brings in a newer species into the geographical area. So we have come across a new term, adaptive radiation. What is this adaptive radiation then? It is the evolution of different form of living organism from the ancestral stock, which are separated into subgroups by means of the geographical barriers. You can take the earlier example itself. The original ancestral population of rabbits getting divided into two species by means of the physical barrier of the river. One side we find the white colored rabbit, the other side the grey colored rabbit. Two different species are formed. It is because they adapt to that newer environment. So what's bringing them to adapt to the newer environment? It is this physical barriers. So new species are getting evolved. Thus new organisms adapt to different environmental conditions to show the genetical changes in them. These genetical changes are later inherited to the young ones and new species gets formed. This process of new species formation is called as cladogenesis. So they are totally different from that of the ancestors. Down in the picture we can see origin of new species by geographical isolating mechanisms between red beetles and Galapagos finches. The red beetles, where we look at here, they tend to isolate it by means of barriers which are marked by means of blue colored barriers here. They totally differentiated into two separate population and two different environment they enter into, and two different color organisms are mutated there, and they get inherited to the generations, and a new species gets formed. So when you look at the current population and the ancestral population, both never look similar. They totally show a different type of species. So when a population become totally different type of species, we call the process as cladogenesis. Cladogenesis is possible for a species when they enter into adaptive radiation. So remember this concept. Similarly, the Galapagos finches too. So they adopt two different islands and the kind of food source available there. So thereby, those changes in the beak modifications, genes were seen in them, and those genes were inherited into their young ones, and they formed a new, totally a new species. When a new species totally is formed, which shows difference in the characters with that of the ancestral stock, we call it as cladogenesis. During the evolution process, the geographic changes like change in the temperature, change in the rainfall, change in the environmental factors brings in these adaptive radiations in the organisms. The adaptive radiation leads to the type of evolution called divergent evolution. Just now we have understood adaptive radiation forms totally different types of species of organisms in the environment. It is due to genetic changes in the organisms to suit or fit itself to the newer environment to which it gets exposed to. So what's happening to the evolution process when new species are getting from the original stock? The original stock is forming many number of subspecies. We call that evolution as divergent evolution. So a single ancestral stock can form many new species, and it is by means of the geographical barriers and the spreading of process of newer environment of habitats and food sources becomes very common for those particular organisms. So new species keeps on forming. The same example we can quote here of red beetles. At the time of new environment, individuals will acquire mutations or any genetic changes in them and form a new species. The example of Albert and Kebab squirrels. Habitat is totally different. So new characters are eventually gets formed in the population of organisms that get exposed to the newer environment. Genetic isolation was also noticed in Australian marsupials, which developed various species of carnivores, herbivores, burrowers, and flyers. So same marsupials have formed different types of organisms. Some are carnivores, some are herbivores, some are burrowers, some are flyers. How this is possible? It is because the organisms are exposed to different environments. So adaptations are seen and new characters are imbibed in the organisms. Students, remember here, genetic isolation forms a new species which are reproductively isolated. And this process we call it as allopatric or vicariant speciation. Allos in Greek means different or other. Patros means fatherland. So, the fatherland of new species is totally different here. That is the ancestor. Fatherland refers to the ancestor. So, it is totally different for them. Their genetic variations and speciation that occurs in these new species is entirely different from that of the ancestors. So genes, what they have for the characters will vary, bringing them totally a different species. So remember students, geographical isolation will bring in different kind of species, which we call it as allopathic speciation. If new species are formed by means of geographical barriers, we call it as allopathic speciation. During evolution process, the geographic changes like movement of continents, then formation of mountains, islands, water bodies, glaciers, and even human activities such as agriculture, then urbanization. All these changes have brought in changes in the environment in various population also. So new species are formed because of all these geographical changes. These changes have isolated ancestral population and have made them to move to a new environment. They showed genetic variations which are accepted and selected by nature. And these changes may be like selective pressures of genetic drift, mutations, etc. So, the genetic changes in the organisms is mainly due to the newer environment to which the organisms are exposed to make themselves fit to the changed environment. These changes have made them to excel as a newer species which cannot breed with its ancestral population. Even between the other species of the same area, that is also important. So they become reproductively isolated. That's what it otherwise means. Example here are red beetles with genetic variations. So they become sexually different individuals. It was due to the predators which carried these red beetles to a newer environment, a newer area. There the random mating has led to the formation of newer species. So green colored beetles are formed from the red beetles mainly due to the speciation process by geographical barrier here. Newer species here amongst the red beetles is due to factors. Number one, variation that accumulates in them. Okay, change in the genes that gets accumulated in them. Number two, these variations were selected by nature. Mean to say, they are accepted by the nature, make them fit, and thereby these characters will be inherited to the generations and a totally new species gets formed. So this is about the importance of geographical isolation, students. After we understanding the concept of geographical isolation, now we will understand the MCQs related to it. MCQ 1. Shall we start? Yes. The death of every member of a species. In a species of population, if every member dies, what do you call the processes? C, extinction. So answer is C, extinct. Question 2. In bird beak lab, is what we have understood of Galapagos finches by Darwin. What environmental factor caused variation in diversity among the finches? What was the factor, causative factor for the finches to have different beaks, modification in the beaks, different diversity of finches, how are they formed? A, variety of food sources, yes. No mates were available, no. Location of habitat is also no. Length of feathers and wings. It is the variety of food sources have brought them to have the beak modification because it's a bird beak lab. Answer of point C can also be considered, but it is related to the beak modification alone. So there the location of habitat doesn't give them different beaks. It is a variety of food sources gives them definitely varieties of beak. So answer is A, variety of food sources. Question 3. Speciation can occur as a result of geographical isolation because A, members of species can no longer find mates. Mates are available because they live in population. Populations that live in different environment may get exposed to different selective pressures. This point is correct because in geographical isolation, the populations will divide into subgroups and exposed to different environments. And there, they further get exposed to different selective pressures of genetic drift, mutations, genetic variations, etc. And that brings in the speciation there. C, exchange of genes during recombination. That doesn't happen at all. So movement of genes with a population, within a population because of interbreeding. This also doesn't take place. So answer is B. Question 4. Two species of whales, the aquatic organisms, are divided by a physical barrier that connects two continents. So they move apart to a two different continental area. What type of isolation is this? Geographic isolation, behavioral isolation, temporal isolation, zygotic mortality. It is geographic isolation because physical barrier is involved here. Answer is A. Sorry students, I have written here as B. It should be A. Geographic isolation. MCQ 5. Based on the image below, what type of isolation is shown? So definitely the river is the barrier. It is of geographic isolation. Answer is B, geographic isolation. The evolution of a species based on sum total of adaptive changes. So what particular force is making the adaptive changes in the species of organisms? It is isolation. So answer is D, isolation. Well students, after we understanding the MCQs, we have come to the last part, that is outcome of the session. What have we understood in the concept of geographic isolation? So different is, the way the geographical barriers will bring in adaptive changes, genetic variations that gets inherited and a new species is formed. So cladogenesis. So this is what we have learned in the concept of today's session. The web references includes Wikipedia and Britannica.com. Book references includes Organic Evolution by Veerabala Rastogi, Cell Biology, Genetics, Molecular Biology and Evolution and Ecology by Verma and Agarwal. Well, students, thank you all. Your queries, comments can be posted to my personal WhatsApp number. Take care of your good health during this pandemic time.